During the course of the Great Crusade, as the Emperor sought to reunite all of humanity's lost colony worlds under his banner, the armies of the nascent Imperium would be forced into battle against many strange and powerful foes of both human and Xenos origin. Many of the enemies faced by the Emperor's forces would display a number of powerful, almost sorcerous abilities due to their use of individuals that were capable of harnessing the energies of the warp. In order to counteract the powers demonstrated by such beings upon the battlefield, as well as to take advantage of the fact that a number of Space Marines had already begun exhibiting psychic abilities of their own, the Primarchs Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns, Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, and Jagatai Khan of the White Scars would propose the formation of a specialist division within the Legione Astartes so as to harness and hone the traits exhibited by such individuals. The Emperor of Mankind would agree to this proposal, leading to the implementation of the Librarians. Many of the Space Marine legions that did not already possess such psychically sensitive warriors within their ranks would begin to actively recruit such individuals. Despite this, many throughout the Imperium would continue to view Psykers with distrust, viewing them as being little more than dangerous mutants. The Thousand Suns in particular, whose legionaries were all claimed to be Psykers of varying potency, faced immense hatred and judgment from the greater whole of the Imperium, and prior to their reunion with their Primarch, many had called for the Legion itself to be disbanded. Following the events of the Ulanor campaign, and the Emperor's subsequent withdrawal from the Great Crusade in order to begin work on his secret Webway project, doubts would begin surfacing as to whether or not the Librarius project should be allowed to continue. These doubts would in turn turn into allegations leveled against the Thousand Suns, who were accused of dabbling in sorcery following Leman Russ, the Primarch of the Space Wolves and longtime critic and skeptic of Magnus the Red, bearing witness to the effects of the Flesh Change, the genetic flaw of the Thousand Suns Legion, upon the world of Shrike. Russ's accusations would soon be joined by those of Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard, who had long harboured a grudge against Psykers in general. The Death Lord would begin claiming that the introduction of the Librarians, whose members were, more often than not, trained by the Thousand Suns, was a way for Magnus to corrupt the legions with sorcery. Meanwhile, Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists and Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard would begin to outright refuse to fight alongside the Thousand Suns or any other legion that made use of Librarians upon the battlefield. In response to these ever-increasing allegations, the Emperor of Mankind was forced to convene a symposium upon the world of Nikaea, which would come to be known within historical records, appropriately enough, as the Council of Nikaea. The purpose of this assembly was, at least officially, to debate the continued use of Psykers throughout the ranks of the Legione Astartes. However, many viewed this council as being little more than a hearing to determine if the various accusations made against Magnus and the Thousand Suns held any weight, leading to this series of events also becoming known as the Trial of Magnus the Red. Many would begin to make their case against the Thousand Suns and the Librarians for various reasons, including a somewhat hypocritical argument made by the Space Wolf rune priest Othair Weirdmake, who would denounce the Thousand Suns as being little more than witches and warlocks, despite Weirdmake also being a Psyker. Some would point to the events of Old Night, which saw rogue Psykers run rampant across thousands of worlds, blaming their actions for the onset of the Age of Strife, while others would bring attention to the Sisters of Silence, a warrior order comprised entirely of psychic nulls which had been formed primarily to counteract such threats. For over 3 long hours, Magnus's detractors would continue making their arguments against the implementation of Psykers, and in turn the use of their powers throughout the Imperium. Magnus, however, would counter his critics with an impassioned defense. The Primarch would point out the necessity of Psykers for the Imperium to function as intended, citing the use of astropaths for interstellar communication and navigators for void travel. Magnus would also argue that any fear of the unknown was nothing more than a sign of ignorance, and that he merely bore a desire to learn and in turn allow the Imperium to make use of his findings. To emphasize his point, The Primarch would remind those before him that in centuries past, humanity believed that Terra was the center of the universe, or that Terra itself was flat, until various scholars, philosophers, and scientists discovered that this was not the case. Magnus would also remind those assembled that everything regarding a Primarch, an Astartes, or an Astropath would be regarded by those who are primitive or ignorant as being magical, from their weapons and armor, their size and strength, or any psychic abilities that they may exhibit. Eventually, librarians from a number of different legions would make a symbolic stand with the Primarch, and argued their case in both support of Magnus and the Librarius. The White Scar Stormseer, Tagata Yasuge, would state that a Psyker's abilities were no different from that of a common bolter or chainsword, which, while dangerous tools, they were simply that, tools. Yasuge would propose a compromise, suggesting that while the practice of sorcery should be forbidden, Psykers should still be allowed to make use of their abilities, emphasizing that the best way to deal with the situation at hand was not to eradicate the Librarius, but to instead ensure that such individuals were properly and intensively trained. The Emperor would ultimately decree that the Librarius of each Space Marine Legion was to be disbanded, and that any psychically sensitive Astartes were to be returned to rank and file duties, where they would also be forbidden from utilizing their abilities. In addition, any studies being conducted into the talents of Psykers or the mysteries of the warp in general were to cease effective immediately. The only Psykers that were permitted to continue serving within the Legione Astartes and make use of their talents were the various navigators and astropaths assigned to each legion. This decree, which would become known as the Edict of Nikaea, would even forbid the Primarchs themselves from utilizing any psychic talents that they possessed. Little did the Emperor realize that such a decree would effectively handicap the Loyalist legions during the course of the Horus Heresy, as it would eventually be discovered that the powers of Psykers were one of the most potent weapons to wield against the demonic entities that battled alongside the traitor legions. Prior to the onset of the heresy itself, and following Horus's decision to rebel against the Emperor, Magnus the Red would use his sorceress abilities in a desperate attempt to warn the Emperor of mankind of the War Master's betrayal. However, instead of heeding his warning, the Emperor sought to punish Magnus for his actions, which not only saw the Primarch violating the terms of the edict, but also result in irreparable damage to the Terran Webway project, which in turn created a warp tear that threatened to engulf Terra itself. This series of events would then lead to the burning of Prospero, forcing the Thousand Sons to seek sanctuary with the traitor legions. But what if the Edict of Nikaea never came to pass? What if Magnus the Red instead convinced the Emperor to allow him and his legion to not only continue utilizing their psychic abilities, but even continue in their studies of the warp? The first key difference would be that the Loyalist forces would have had a far easier time in combating against any demons employed by the traitors, especially during events such as the Battle of Calv or the Siege of Terra itself. As mentioned earlier, demonic entities, barring a few rare exceptions such as the Fleshhounds of Khorne, demonstrate little to no resistance to the powers of Psykers. Because of this, some of the Loyalist legions may have even potentially fielded squads of Librarians, which would be deployed to counteract any demonic presence upon the battlefield, similar in function to the modern-day Grey Knights. However, such a turn of events could have potentially spelled disaster for the Imperial Fists Legion during the Siege of Terra. Following the passing of the edict, Rogaldorn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, would confine each and every member of his legion's Librarians within the dungeons of the Imperial Fists flagship, the Phalanx. This act would prove to be unintentionally beneficial to the Legion during the onset of the Siege of Terra. As detailed within the novel The Solar War, a demonic incursion led by the demon prince Samus would erupt upon the Phalanx. With all other options exhausted, Rogaldorn would choose to disregard the edict and unleash his legion's Librarians against the demons. If the edict had never been passed, and the Imperial Fist's librarians were not subsequently confined to the Phalanx, then it's possible that, in this case, there may have been fewer or possibly even no librarians aboard the Phalanx, as such individuals may have instead been utilised to reinforce the Legion's ground forces within the Imperial Palace. This in turn could result in the Imperial Fists sustaining more casualties in their defense of the Phalanx, or possibly even the Phalanx itself falling into traitor hands. If this were indeed the case, then it is even possible that Rogal Dorn could have been slain in his duel against Samus. Another major difference that would occur with the terms of the edict never being implemented is that the majority of Space Marine legions, and in turn their modern day successor chapters, would lack the specialist officers known as chaplains, who serve as spiritual leaders and figureheads to their battle brothers. Following the passing of the edict, Malcador the Sigillite, inspired by the chaplaincy of the Wordbearers Legion, who were the first legion to make use of such officers within their ranks, would pass a decree known as the Order of Observance. This order would force the other Primarchs to introduce the rank of chaplain within their respective legions, appointing the most steadfast and loyal warriors to such a rank. Not only would the chaplains offer spiritual counsel and reassurance to those now former members of the Librarians, as well as tend to the spiritual well-being of the Legion itself, but they would also ensure that the terms of the Edict of Nikaea were enforced. Despite the remaining Primarchs being ordered to implement the rank of chaplain within their legions, some refused to do so. In fact, some of these legions already made use of similar such officers, such as the Wardens of the Blood Angels, the Iron Fathers of the Iron Hands, who also fulfilled the role of Tech Marine, the Wolf Priests of the Space Wolves, who also serve as apothecaries, and the Voices of Fire within the Salamanders. Despite this, the Primarchs of these legions would entrust these specialist officers with the responsibilities which were being expected of a more traditional chaplaincy. If the Edict of Nikaea had not come to pass, then it seems highly likely that, with the exception of the Wordbearers, Blood Angels, Salamanders, Iron Hands, and Space Wolves, the position of chaplain or a similar such equivalent would not have been integrated into the command structure of the legions. Another change that would come into effect for the modern-day Imperium is that a greater number of Space Marine chapters would make use of librarians upon the battlefield. Some modern-day chapters, such as the Marines Malevolent, still adhere to the terms of the edict and refuse to allow psychers within their ranks. However, if the edict itself was never passed, then such chapters would be more likely to maintain a librarius of their own, barring those that would refuse to associate with psychers due to the native culture of their homeworlds. Not only this, but if the Emperor never issued his edict, then there is even a chance, albeit an incredibly small one, that the Thousand Sons could have remained loyal to the Imperium during the course of the Horus Heresy. Since the use of psychic powers by the legions would not have been outlawed, then Magnus would have been able to utilize his powers in order to circumvent the warp storms that blocked astropathic communications to Terra in his attempts to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal without such an action being immediately deemed as a crime. While the Primarch's actions would still have caused immense damage to the Emperor's Webway project, due to Magnus inadvertently striking a bargain with the Chaos God Tzeentch, there also exists a minute possibility that the Emperor may have been more willing to heed Magnus's warning, due to not violating the terms of the edict. Admittedly, it is still highly likely that Magnus would have been reprimanded for his actions in damaging the Webway project. But if the Emperor did indeed allow Magnus to deliver his warning, then any potential punishment may have occurred in the aftermath of the heresy. However, the odds of this potential possibility are still unbelievably slim. As such, while Magnus may have not violated the edict, the very act of damaging the Webway may still result in the Emperor dispatching the Space Wolves to bring Magnus to Terra in chains, so as to punish him for causing such irreparable damage. However, should the Emperor decide not to send Russ and his wolves to Prospero due to taking Magnus's claim seriously, then this in turn may also mean that the event known as the Burning of Prospero would not have taken place. By extension, this would not only result in the Space Wolves and the Thousand Sons having a greater number of troops when the heresy finally began in earnest, but the Thousand Sons would not have been forced to seek sanctuary with the traitor legions following their confrontation with the Wolves. If the Thousand Sons remained as loyalists, then the events of the Horus Heresy would have a greater bias towards the loyalist legions, as 10 legions would be pitted against the 8 that had aligned themselves with Horus, although the Raven Guard, Iron Hands, and Salamanders would still more than likely be decimated during the course of the Istvan V dropsite massacre. Not only this, but Magnus the Red would not have had his soul shattered into numerous shards, nor would the Primarch have ever ascended to demonhood. In turn, this would also mean that a fragment of Magnus' soul would never have become implanted within the Loyalist Thousand Son known as Reviel Arvida, which in turn would mean that not only would Arvida likely die as a result of the flesh change, but he would never have become transformed into the being known as Janus, the first Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights. In addition, the traitor legions would have found it far more difficult to bypass the many spheres of defense that lay throughout the Sol system in order to reach Terra, as it would be due to a ritual conducted by the Thousand Sons that allowed a sizable portion of Horus's armada to materialize within orbit of the world. Since the Thousand Sons could have remained as loyalists, then without Magnus and his sons to aid them with their sorcery, the traitor legions would be forced to effectively brute force their way through Dawn's defenses, sustaining heavier casualties and in turn leaving Horus with fewer troops with which to conduct his siege. The removal of the Thousand Sons from the ranks of the traitors would also result in Tzeentch not becoming the patron god of any one particular legion, although it is possible that another legion could have drawn his eye. Magnus himself may have spent the majority, if not the entirety of the Horus Heresy upon the Golden Throne, in order to harness its rampant, uncontrollable energies, perhaps even for the remainder of his existence. As revealed within the novel A Thousand Sons, Magnus would discover that he was created for the express purpose of operating the Golden Throne. This in turn would allow the Emperor to take a more proactive role during the course of the war, allowing him to not only relay his orders directly without needing beings such as Malcador or Constantine Valdor to interpret his will, but also participate in the war within the Webway to a far greater extent, allowing the Master of Mankind to use his godlike powers to aid the Legio Custodes and Sisters of Silence against the vast horde of demonic entities that poured through the breach. But again, the odds of the Thousand Sons remaining loyal due to the Edict of Nikaea never coming into effect are incredibly low. As such, it is unlikely that the course of the Horus Heresy itself would have changed by any significant degree. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.